This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Welcome to the show. This is your host, Georgina Rose, and welcome in. In this episode, we are going to be talking about a topic that I haven't really explored before. A previous guest has been Hindu, but we haven't really gotten into Hinduism in a more intense and deeper sense. So in this episode, we're going to talk about Hinduism. We're going to be talking about how monotheism have impacted Hinduism, the idea of a plural world, cultural identity, how Christian and Islamic proselytization has harmed Hinduism, and how this affects our world, and what, as Western polytheists, we should know about this. I am thrilled to be joined by a lovely guest. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Sankrant Sanu, and I have had the privilege of actually living about half my life in India and the other half in the United States, and traveled to about 50 countries, mainly to study culture. I've been an advocate of indigenous cultures and languages. I have a book called The English Medium Myth, which challenges the hegemony of English, especially in India, where most of the other languages are subservient to it. So, really, very much about celebrating the plural world.
So that's interesting to me. India, I wouldn't necessarily think English would be sort of the prominent language there. Is that because of the British rule the country was under?
Yes, yes, very much so. What happened is that even though we got independence, a number of the institutions that were set up during British times continued. This includes the bureaucracy, the judiciary, really most of the organs of the state, and also the indigenous education system in India, which was a flourishing system, was actually uprooted, and the British system was imposed on top. A lot of that which favored English education.
Oh, that's really interesting. When England was sort of dominating India, was there a heavy like Christian missionary presence, or has that sort of, because I know I was reading up on what some Hindus in India are saying, and I've noticed there's a sort of hostility that seems pretty justified towards Christian missionaries. Is that sort of related to that?
Well, I think during the British times they were actually a little more circumspect because the British were really economic looters more than anything else, and they were very worried about allowing missionaries a completely free hand because they didn't want to have one more reason for revolt. I mean, they were already putting India under completely usurious taxation. They were taxing sometimes even more than 100% of the produce because it would be based on averages, and it even if there was a low year or a famine, they would claim to take away all the produce or most of it. So they were already imposing all these policies on India, and so even though Christian missionaries did um, impact, but most of it was actually in the atrocity literature they produced about society more than the direct proselytization they were able to do.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What was sort of in the atrocity literature? What did that kind of cover?
You
Because
know,
I'm not super familiar with that.
yeah, it's a term worth understanding because that's how pretty much all pagan societies were treated in the proselytism sort of war. What you find is, when they land in the Americas, when they land in other places of the world, there's always the story of how evil the natives are, right? And if you hear the story about India, it's all about sati and the caste system, like all these stereotypes that we've been told, and we've imagined them to be true. They were burning widows at the fire, and all of this. So a lot of that was actually missionary driven propaganda rather than based on what was actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know when Europe was converted away from paganism and into Christianity, pretty much every society that was pagan that held on to it a little longer was written in some form as doing like these horrific things with very little sort of stuff substantiating it.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. I mean, even if you, it's kind of the stereotype is the witch hunts where there was pagan knowledge that was carried by the women, and so they were of course evil for doing that, and so that template has played throughout European society and everywhere around the world as well.
Yeah, and I know that I was wondering, I know that in India there's a rise of Islamic proselytization. Do they do similar stuff as the older Christian missionaries was to sort of spread that idea?
I think in the Islamic case, it was um, largely by the sword and also through unequal taxation and unequal largesse from the royal court. So, for instance, there was an Aurangzeb who was a Mughal emperor. He imposed the jizya tax on Hindus. Of course, if you converted, you wouldn't be paying the tax. A lot of the patronage was given to musicians and artisans and other people who converted. So there was a lot of that, both economic warfare and conversion, as well as literally, you'll be beheaded if you don't convert, that kind of thing. There was less. I think the British were and the colonial rule under the British, especially with the atrocity literature produced by Christians, was much more inimical intellectually, whereas and economically, whereas the defeat at the hand of the Islamic armies, of course, there was resistance all the time, but the challenge from the Islamic case was much more from a military force standpoint.
Okay, that makes sense. Because recently I read through a thing called the Book of the Idols, which was written by an Islamic historian talking about the sort of fall of pagan Arabia. And I was reading through it, and obviously it was, very much biased, but it was like every, page ended with, and then we destroyed the idol, and then we sort of, forced the conversion. And it
Right.
did seem sort of a different way of explaining it than if you read, Christian writing on, say, what, the Druids were doing in the UK.
Right, right, right. Yeah. If you read the accounts of Islamic conquest by Islamic historians themselves of India, it's always about subduing the kafir and destroying their idols and getting rid of evil and so on and so forth through force.
Does that still play out today?
I think it plays out today much more subtly. Uh, I think there is certainly propaganda that happens at a certain level, for instance, against murti puja, which is the Sanskrit for what is called idol worship, but it's slightly different in how it's understood. So murti puja or uh, other expressions of popular Hinduism, but I think a lot of the conversion in the Islamic case in India right now is happening either through targeting women for conversion or by economic warfare of different kinds.
I've always noticed that whenever big religious or cultural changes happen, it does tend to happen with women because if you think about it, women are kind of the ones who carry culture in a family because they're the ones who spend the most time around kids and thus tend to instill whatever cultural background they're from into their children. You see that in a variety of religions and cultures. And I think it's sort of a recurring theme when it comes with cultural preservation or anything on the other side of that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's one of the elements. Even the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Indian text, says that if something happens and the women lose their way in a way, then all of society is destroyed because women are really the ones that are carrying the torch, so to say.
Yeah. I've noticed that Hinduism really has managed to preserve a lot of elements of culture over time. How do you think it sort of survived? Because pretty much every other polytheist tradition has kind of fallen apart over these past thousands of years, whereas Hinduism has been pretty resilient, clearly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because especially a lot of people in India, a lot of Hindus in India bemoan the defeat, which of course happened at the hands of both Islamic conquest and the British colonization, but they don't realize that we are also the survivors in many ways. That we are, we are one of the people who withstood that shock, and of course were things were altered and changed, and a lot of suffering took place, but we managed to survive with many of the threads of our tradition in continuity. And so the real question is, what is the reason for it? One of the reasons is, I believe, that our traditions were always very decentralized, and also India was an immense power of those days. It was by many accounts of Europeans and even other people, the land that was sought after. Of course, Columbus was trying to find the way to India. Everybody wanted a sea route to India, or a way to reach India, because it was supposed to be the fabled land of riches, and so on and so forth. So it was a very powerful entity. And one of the things that happened in India that allowed that resistance was, there is no central, Hindu religious figure, for instance, that if you destroy it, then you can take over, or even if you converted the king, or even if you destroyed the king, because the tradition is much more dispersed and spread over. Every village has their deity, and every river and every tree and so all these things are sacred to the people. So it's, you literally have to go into every village and like kill every single people, which or convert every single person, which of course they tried, but it was much bigger than where, if you see in even in other places, a lot of times, if you got the head to convert, this happened in European Christianity, for instance, right? If the king becomes Protestant from being Catholic, then a lot of people will then become Protestant, just following the king. But this
Yeah.
wasn't the case in India.
Yeah, with the European conversion, there was a lot of that. Like the head of the state would sort of change religions, and then slowly with time, starting in the urban centers and then moving out to the sort of rural areas, there would be a steady conversion, or there would be some sort of financial incentive to convert. That happened a lot in the Scandinavian countries.
Right.
Pretty consistently, there would be this slow movement from the cities out, which, interestingly enough, the word pagan, which is overwhelmingly used when talking about European traditions today, actually has another definition which relates to sort of rural peoples, which I've always
Really,
found.
yeah, yeah. Like heathen also has a similar, I think, root, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it does, because people would progressively convert, with the last one to convert being Lithuania,
Right.
interestingly enough.
Wow. Huh, interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I remember being in Estonia also, and hearing the stories of their conversion, which was quite late as well.
Yeah, it was pretty much everywhere that was near like Southern Europe, Rome area, and then it sort of just like went out in all directions from there,
Right.
taking a while. In India, have you noticed a sort of similar thing where people are more like devoutly religious in rural areas versus urban areas, or does that just not apply to India at all?
Well, I think we might even. There is this one scholar that I follow and respect a lot. His name is Balagangadhar. He's based in Belgium, in Ghent, and he has put forth this theory, which says that really the only thing that can be characterized by the term religion is these three monotheisms. And the reason for that is that the relationship of the non, for lack of a better word, for the non-monotheistic people with their traditions is different than what religion created later on. Uh, and I'd even say that it's sort of monotheism versus nature. What is natural, and I know we use we're kind of forced to use all these terms, but these terms themselves are created by the discourse that follows from Christianity and from their categorization of us as polytheists and so on and so forth. Whereas if I look at many of the indigenous traditions, uh, they're simply in tune with nature. They're following natural law. I mean, in natural law is called dharma in Sanskrit, but they're following what is natural to their land, to the people, and what has been passed on from their ancestors. Religion has a different connotation around doctrine and God's intervention into the planet through these commandments and so on and so forth, which is a completely different flavor of how the indigenous traditions understood themselves.
Oh, absolutely. I find when I discuss this stuff with people who are not polytheist and are, I live in the West, so the majority of people are Christian, or at least I would say culturally Christian. And I find that they're always kind of trying to put this stuff within the terms they know, within the definitions they know, and they kind of get a little confused when things exist outside of that paradigm.
Right, right, and that, I think that's a struggle we all have because India, because of being colonized, and our terminology being colonized, and people, all of different parts of the world in Europe, because of so many centuries and centuries of Christian conversion, as well as the academic study, where all the terminology is constructed through, these were theological universities that later became academia, right? So there were a lot of them were initially church based theological schools. So because of all of that, I think it's a struggle, and I can imagine it's even a greater struggle for when one doesn't even have a language which is separated. Like a lot of times what I would do is I would try to go back to the original language, like in India, I'd go back to Sanskrit or one of the local languages or Hindi or something like that, and say, okay, well, they're talking about this concept in this way, but let me see and try to even express it in my language. Does it make sense? And a lot of times, one can start to see the difference and nuance because the language that we use is speaking of it in a different way. And I think the the I would imagine it's a little more difficult when there is, the original language has been so much erased and replaced by this Christian terminology. For instance, in many of the European languages where it was Latinized, and then the Latin itself was coming from the church. So yeah, I mean, I think the terminological issues we'll have to continue to discuss for some time.
Yeah, language I've noticed always, has a real value in these religious discussions. And it always, it always comes back to that. There's so many traditions across the world where the language itself, like even just the letters themselves, have a sort of spiritual and dimension to them. In India, does Hindi or any of the local languages have that? Is there like some sort of Hindu connection or identity with specific languages, or no?
Absolutely, it comes from Sanskrit actually, which is the root language, and there is a script associated with it. Of course, it's written in many different scripts, but even the different scripts in India have a common structure, and the script itself has a grammar, and that grammar was specified in this ancient text by Panini's in the Sanskrit grammar. And so the entire alphabet is based on a matrix that comes from different sound producing capabilities of the mouth. So, like the first lineup, first we talk about all the vowels. I mean, we say all the vowels in our alphabet, and then we go to the consonants, and each of the consonant, like the first line is k, k, g, g, which is all of the sounds that are coming from the back of the throat, you know and then so this is how. And then there's the labial sounds, and there's there's the guttural, the labial. All of these are arranged as a matrix, and so it's a very, very precise uh, language and grammar, and that lives on in all of the Indian languages. It definitely allows us access to, and also the fact that Sanskrit is, I mean, we can read the Sanskrit text from 3,000 years ago, and it's the same Sanskrit. So that's really remarkable. Like this, the Sanskrit language has maintained this thread throughout a tradition where the chanting that they're doing now is the same Sanskrit, and it can be understood as well.
That's really beautiful that that sort of identity has been able to survive and last for so long. How much does Hinduism sort of inform the cultural identity of India?
Well, I would say that, coming back to, the discussion on religion, Hinduism is not an ism in that form where it's a dogma. So I would even go further in saying the Hindu traditions are the cultural identity of India. So I'd written an article, it's on my blog, sankrant.org, where I talk about why India is a nation. And in what I say there is that if you look at the Hindu tradition, it has always had this notion of this landmass of India as a unity. There is this very amazing story of Shiva, who's carrying, the story of Shakti, the mother goddess, in one of her forms. Um, she's ends up being split up into all these pieces, and all these pieces fall precisely on the landmass of what is India, like Greater India, of course, before the partition that was caused in 1947 by the British. But the landmass, if you even if you look at a geographical map of the Indian region, even without any political boundaries, you can kind of spot India as that peninsula that goes from the ocean all the way to the Himalayas. So there is a geographical identity of India, and you can find hymns of thousands of years ago that recognize that identity. And not only that, you have all these pilgrimage spots that form like different kinds of loops and triangles and rectangles circumnavigating that entity.
That's fascinating because I've noticed across European pagan traditions, there's this idea in quite a few of them that, the land itself has a spiritual dimension to it, and the sort of spirits of the place have their own, mystic value to them, and that sort of has made up that nation on that sort of esoteric level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a very definite idea in the Hindu tradition where there is something like Grama Devata, which literally means the Devata or the deity of the village, and for each bigger grouping there is this notion of uh, of a spirit which is which is conscious, which embodies that area. And and so definitely I would not be surprised if that thread runs across all of the indigenous pagan traditions.
Yeah, I feel like they really do all, no matter sort of where they're from, connect to this idea that land and nature itself has a spiritual dimension, which is, in a lot of ways, kind of rejected by the monotheistic faiths.
Absolutely, absolutely. In some senses, the biggest distinction, so the distinction that monotheists claim between what they are and what, quote, the other in their mind was that we worship one god and all these ignorant people don't know, and so they worship many gods. But the real distinction is that the they have this notion of God which is completely removed from nature, which is out there somewhere, and it has no uh, it's not really imminent. I mean, of course, there's the story of being imminent through Jesus and so on and so forth. But from the point of view of all the indigenous tradition, I mean, the sun and the moon and the stars and the land and the river and the trees, all of them are divine. So it's all imbued with spirit. It's all imbued with consciousness, and we don't have this break. There's this really interesting book called the Price of Monotheism. I don't know if you've read that,
I
but
have not.
I think it's a really fascinating book. It's by Jan Assman, who's an Egyptologist, and he traces how uh, how really monotheism forms or is almost brought by Moses from Egypt and then is formed. And he talks about the big difference is not mono versus poly. The big difference is transcendent God versus something which is really part of part of everything.
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense because I do find that when it's reduced to like the amount of gods as the distinction, it does kind of oversimplify things because there are bigger, I think, philosophic differences than just the amount
Absolutely,
of deities.
absolutely, yeah. And so in terms, for instance, in the Hindu tradition, both ideas exist simultaneously. Like, of course, there are many deities that one can worship or one can approach or one can connect with, but there's also the sense that there is one consciousness that underlines everything. So both those ideas go simultaneously, but that consciousness is not separated out. It's not this dude who's sitting in the sky with who's separate from from nature. And this is true for the other gods, like whether you say the god of thunder or the god of fire, of all of these, even in the Norse or Roman pre-Christian ideas. They're very much in a way connected with elements of nature one way or the other.
Oh yeah, I think that one of the differences when I was talking to a friend of mine who is Christian is I find that Christianity and in a larger sense, all the monotheistic faiths, they're very focused on breaking beyond the material world and the material plane. Whereas I find that paganism and the more, I guess, indigenous traditions are much more centered in this plane, in a sense.
Yes, and also I think the other aspect, again, this may be a little um, well, controversial for lack of a better word, but I think there's an aspect of the feminine also which is is present, where it's imbued. It's like very much on the earth, it's on the planet, rather than this sort of male god sitting in the sky who's dictating to people.
Yeah, I fully believe that like the divine masculine and the divine feminine are supposed to come together rather than just a single one be prioritized. In Hinduism, aren't there like entire traditions devoted to the feminine?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only devoted to the feminine, our conception of the ultimate consciousness is ardh narishwar, which literally means half man and half woman.
That's
So,
really beautiful.
so the ultimate divine is half man, and there's this beautiful imagery. You'll find Shiva and Shakti like in this cosmic embrace. So there's this cosmic embrace to the point they're melded into one, and there are dance forms in India where you'd have a dancer who's like had this makeup and dress so that when they turn their face on one side they're female, and they turn their face on the other side they're fully male.
Yeah, I've seen some of the like videos online of the sort of traditional dancing in India, and it's really beautiful, and it does have it seems like an almost spiritual quality to it.
Absolutely, and this is one of my own discoveries and return to the tradition in a way. I was actually educated in a Catholic school in India, and I lived in the West for a long time. Lived in America for 30 years, and and I was exploring a lot of things. I was exploring a lot of ideas, and I was part of this tradition called the Gurdjieff work, which is actually a Russian Armenian kind of mystic tradition for a while, and they were very much about bringing awareness into the present moment. And when I got into moments of awareness, it suddenly opened up the Hindu tradition for me, and I realized that it was a society which had really systematized how to raise consciousness. And all of their forms, whether it's art, whether it's dance, whether it's music, whether it's food, was designed so this awareness and the level of consciousness could rise, so we could actually sort of have the spiral going upwards, where we could actually see reality for what it is. So that was my own big transformation, to realize that all of these were spiritual in a way, but even more, I think even the spiritual material distinction is kind of artificial, because for us they're the dance which is intertwined, you know.
Yeah, for a long time, I had this idea that the spiritual and the material were like almost diametrically opposed. And
Mm.
the longer I've sort of explored some of these mystic ideas, as someone who's deeply interested in European polytheism, I noticed that they're less detached than I think, and that by noticing all these small things, by going out in nature and seeing divinity in it, I've really been like, wait, this dichotomy is absolute nonsense. It's
Yes.
not real.
Yeah, even this dichotomy comes from theology, you know.
Yeah,
So,
it's
so
really
yeah,
interesting.
that's why we're all on this discovery of like unpeeling the layers of this onion, that we've been handed.
Yeah, so I was another idea of yours that I was kind of curious about is the something that you talk about, the plural world. What exactly is the plural world?
As the plural world is one that respects the land and of the cultures and the languages. It's really, I mean, in fact, the very, the attack on so-called polytheism, I think, is also coming from this mono-conceptual view of the world. Like, there's so many plants and there's so many animals and there's so many fruits and there's so many different lands and rivers and trees and mountains, and there are so many things that are happening on other planes as well. um, so when I say plural, I mean really celebrating difference rather than trying to erase it.
Yeah, I one of my biggest sort of critiques, I guess, of the monotheistic stuff is they try to really, turn all these different nations and lands with their own distinct polytheistic and indigenous religious traditions into kind of like one thing. They kind of try to, I guess, globalize it, if that would be the term for it.
Yeah, globalize it, or it's like, I think I had a tweet thread about this. It's like, what happens is you take the story of one tribe, right? And then you start claiming that that is the story of the world. And not only do you believe that it's the story of the world, you are required to force everybody else on the planet to believe that's the story of the world. So that means all other stories must become subservient to that one story, which they believe has been handed down to one tribe from their god. Whereas in the indigenous view, they'd be like, yeah, you have your story and I have my story, and what's the conflict? There is no conflict. The conflict only comes when I believe that my story has to have a monopoly on the planet.
Yeah, and it becomes this thing where it's really trying to sort of it eventually like inevitably comes to a point where there's conflict and there's a tribe that doesn't really want to give up their beliefs, and then there has to typically like it escalates pretty quickly because
Exactly.
there's inevitably going to be people who don't want to surrender their culture and beliefs.
Exactly, and I'll throw out one other idea I've been exploring. I haven't actually put it into a paper, but it's this notion of translatability of deities or forms. Whereas, for instance, in the Hindu civilization, when we encountered another, we would say, oh, like, just to give a made up example here, oh, you have Thor, he's just like Indra. We have Indra, it's the same thing. So they're actually doing like mappings of different things, and that translatability creates acceptance, because we're saying, well, yes, we are different, but also look, there's the similarity without imposition. We are not saying, no, no, give up Thor and now you have to worship Indra. We're saying, well, you already have Indra, he's Thor. So so that allows difference to coexist. It doesn't even have to map perfectly, but it's saying we can understand where you are because we have something similar, and you're welcome to your own. Whereas from a monotheistic point of view, they're not going to say, well, Thor is God, like the Christian God, right? They'll say, well, this is a false God. Uh, It's like whatever story they have, because there is only one true God and we have it, and the only way for you to be accepted is for you to buy into that story that we have the one true God.
Yeah, I've always noticed it's really interesting how in all these cultures there are oftentimes gods that I would use the term parallel each other is probably, I guess, the
Yeah,
best word for it.
sure.
Like they have the same kind of attribute to them, but they're still different. You know, they still have sort of the quality of the tradition they are from. And so,
Absolutely, absolutely. So there is similarity and there's difference, and both of them can happily coexist. Um, and there is no reason why they can't coexist. It only The coexistence problem only happens when one side believes in the supremacy of their story, not only for themselves but for others as well.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense because obviously, you know, people are going to take, you know, pride in their own tradition and sort of have that be the one they,
Yeah,
I guess,
exactly.
prioritize. But you can do that and not try to stamp out other people's ideas at the same time, which I think is a notion that a lot of, you know, monotheistic traditions miss. Because if people wanted to be monotheistic and not force it on others, like I don't have any problem with that. I think people can think whatever they want, but
Right.
it's when it becomes a forcing thing that I start to take an issue because I really do believe in, you know, free thought, free speech, all that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and I think that's where really the problem comes in, which is that monotheism. Um, I think even the term I have a problem with. I think it's really monoconception. They're monoconceptual. They only That's why I'm talking this story. They have a story and they believe that's the only true story. Whereas everybody has a story and it's true for them. It's their tradition and it's true for them. And there's a very interesting quote. I have this article called "The Conversion War and Religious Freedom," and there is a quote from the Pueblo Indians, and they're saying that changing your tradition for mine is as absurd as saying changing my ancestors for yours. I mean, I have my tradition and you have yours. Where is the problem? Right? So the problem only comes when you have this notion of false god and false religion, and this monopolistic view that we have truth and the other people are false.
Absolutely. You mentioned ancestry for a second. Within the sort of European polytheistic traditions, the idea of like ancestor veneration, honoring is, you know, something that's emphasized quite a bit. Is that a thing that comes up a lot in Hinduism?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think it's true in all of the indigenous. Even if you look at the Native American and definitely in the Hindu tradition, there is the notion of honoring of ancestors, and also there's a very interesting idea. It took me a while to understand it. It's like the progeny can actually heal the ancestors, not only venerate them. So it's like the work that I do to be free, to be conscious, to uh, evolve, has an impact on not only my succeeding generations but healing of the previous generation. So there's a in India we have these almost like comic book uh, uh, stories where a lot of the texts, which are very complicated, have been put into these picture forms. And I remember this one story where the ancestors are hanging upside down in a cave, and then they're waiting for this one very accomplished progeny who's taking birth finally, so that they can be liberated. So it actually goes both ways. Not only does can one venerate ancestors, but when you are going back to the tradition and rediscovering that, you're actually helping heal their wounds.
I really like that because one thing that comes up a lot in certain sects of the European space is these people kind of take issue with the idea of ancestor veneration because they think their ancestors did bad things or something, which I think is kind of a ridiculous reason not to do
Sure.
ancestor work. I take huge issues with that opinion, but I really like that you mentioned that it's kind of a feedback loop of
Right.
us healing them healing us, because I think that sort of immediately sort of throws out that idea and sort of is like, no, that's
Right.
not
Yeah.
how.
Even if they did bad things for a moment, right? Your work in returning to finding the essence will actually help heal that.
Absolutely. I was wondering, a question that I was sort of curious is, what do you think Westerners get the most wrong about Hinduism, Hindu identity, and India and all that?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to answer it. One is that if you look at the current political discourse in the West, especially in sort of the media, I think it's less from actual global leaders because there's a lot more things that dynamic. But if I look at the general media reporting, for instance, of what's happened since Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, now one can criticize Modi, and I often do on Twitter. I agree with him on certain things, I disagree with him certain things, but the narrative that's been put forth is turning it into some kind of Hindu fascist state, and like just like the story that he's out there and he's like obliterating all others, which is absolute and complete nonsense. In fact, I've actually criticized him for, the British has set up all these divisions in Indian society where they categorize people based on religion and frame different laws based on religion and put different schemes based on religion. And even the government of India today, for instance, if you're a Muslim, you'll get a certain scholarship. If you're a Hindu, you won't. And these are schemes actually put together by the Narendra Modi government, or funded more than they were previously. So one of the things that people absolutely get wrong is, firstly, trying to imagine that the current government or something is turning India into, quote, a Hindu religious state, which is not true. And secondly, trying to map ideas like fascism onto a non-Christian origin society. Like all of those things, fascism, Nazism, are born in the crucible of Christianity. They come from totalitarian ideas, which are then transformed into totalitarian political ideas. And to try to map those ideas into an indigenous culture that doesn't have that foundation creates absolute nonsense. So that's what I'd say from the political standpoint. And I think from the more, if you take back just from the contemporary media reporting and so on and so forth, I think people, there's all these stereotypes, for instance, the caste system or sati, and whatever, women being mistreated, all these stereotypes that are created. And we have to realize that many of those stereotypes are actually distortions, often created by either British accounts or British interventions. I'll give you a couple of examples, and this may surprise you. For instance, the so-called caste system, the British literally create a list. There is actually no word caste. There's no equivalent of the word caste in Sanskrit or in Indian language. There's a whole set of words. There is varna, there is jati, there is kula, there is gotra, there's a whole set of words. And what they do is they glom all of them together. They actually make a list which says this jati, which is jati, the closest thing to jati would be like ethnic group or occupational group or something like that, um, maps to this varna. And they make static lists. The British actually make static lists that document, or rather create, the caste system. And there are hundreds and thousands of letters in protest of this mapping when they do it. Now, what's interesting about those letters of protest is that the account says that this is a society which was static for 5,000 years, and there was this hierarchy which everybody was part of for 5,000 years. But apparently, nobody knew their place on the hierarchy, and everybody was protesting when the British put them one way or the other on the hierarchy. Now, that doesn't make any sense, because if it was static, everybody would know exactly what their place on the hierarchy was. But it wasn't like that. So I think one of the biggest misunderstanding is this whole notion of caste. And this is such a complex topic that I've been myself researching it for years. I still don't understand it. What the actual scenario was, how it was distorted. I think it's continuing research for me personally. But anybody who's a Westerner who thinks they know what the caste system is, they should just know they don't know anything.
Yeah. On that first point, I have noticed a lot of the Western media coverage of current Indian politics. It
Right,
feels very, very slanted. I was watching some of the the documentaries and news bits that were circulating a while ago,
right,
and they were using it seemed like what they were trying to do is take what's happening in India and then put it in like the I guess I would call it pop politics lens, because even in the current West, when talking about like Western politics, we still like filter things through these terms that don't exactly apply to what's happening right now anyways. And
sure,
so it seems like they were doing what they do with our politics, which is filter it through words and phrasing that I don't think is quite right, but they applied it to you guys. And so I think that it made even less sense. And it felt very, some of it even felt kind of anti Hindu, because there would be these like remarks that are kind of thrown in there that felt just a little, I guess, crossing the line might be the term. And on the caste
right,
system, yeah, I was, as a student, I was in like a world religion class that was covering, religions of the world, right? I was intrigued by
right,
that. I kind of care about religion. And like one of the first things when they bring up Hinduism is like they show this like chart of a pyramid and they're like,
right.
this is the Hindu caste system.
That's what's the most absurd thing about that idea, because what people don't realize is that, if, for instance, the Brahmins are considered to be at the top of the pyramid, but they were actually one of the poorest, because they had so many restrictions on them around accumulating wealth, and they were the academics, really. They were the people who were the teachers, and they couldn't actually take wealth for much of what they were doing. That was one of the restrictions that were put on them. So it doesn't map. And the other one, there is so-called untouchable jatis who you'd put at the bottom of the pyramid, but many of them were simply people who lived outside the village, and they were village guards, or village, they were kind of neutral to the village. So if there was a land dispute between so-called, two high caste people in the village, for lack of a better term, um, the person who's the mahar, who's outside the village, who's noted as untouchable and put at the bottom of the hierarchy in this pyramid, would be the judge on that dispute. So where is the hierarchy? The reason why it doesn't make sense is because the other aspect is that this was supposedly a static hierarchy for thousands of years, and nobody protested till the British told them that there was a problem. And the reason why that doesn't make sense is because each jati, actually, each part of it, thought that they were superior in some ways. So it's like everybody thought that they had they had the power and authority that others didn't have, which was also true, and therefore it worked as a synergistic system rather than a hierarchy. It was more like a heterarchy. I think some academics have started using that term now, where one part of society is high in knowledge, another part is high in wealth, another part is high in physical force. So, because there are all these functions that are separated out, it actually makes the whole work together. And there is one thread. I'd put a long thread on this, which some readers might be interested in, where it's almost like, if you take the Varna system is a political theory. It's political theory that says don't intermingle the function of academia with money, for instance. So if your research base, if I was to draw it in contemporary term, if your pharmaceutical research is being driven by how much profits I will make out of it, you will create an aberration. Or if your political class is very influenced by, political lobbies who are pouring money into them, there'll be an aberration. So the Varna system says you have to separate out these main functions of society and not mix them together, because that will create problems in the functioning of society. So they said separate out the money owning class from the warrior class, from the academic class, from the service class.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I can tell you as an American, sometimes this does cause actual issues in our politics and society.
Exactly, right? I mean, so when you start to, so what these people were doing, what these ancient sages were doing, was doing were theorizing how do you have a well functioning society. And like for instance, Europe, after a long experience of mixing state and religion, realized this was a terrible idea, right? So then they came up with secularism. So what what the Indian thinkers or academics or sages or seers or whatever you want to call them said was, just like religion and state, Europe discovered mingling them creates a disaster. They said mingling these certain functions in society creates problems, and we need to keep them separate for a well functioning society.
Interesting. For my final question, because I we are approaching on the hour, jumping off what you last said, is there a concept, because you mentioned that things don't mix in India, and we know that the Western media likes to say India is on the brink of becoming a Hindu theocracy any day now. Is there a concept of secularism or a comparable concept in India?
Well, I think the one that I just explained is coming closer, where they say that there are, it's not just religion and state, which is, again, religion as we understand it in post Christian Europe is not even a concept that really works for India. But the main ideas are, firstly, that India had always had a very diverse range of people with different views and deities and ways of worship. And there are people who are strict vegetarians, and they would literally brush the ground in front of them when they walk because they don't want to accidentally step on an insect. And there are people who are, other sects who are also considered legitimate sects, who are completely flesh eating, or other things that would be completely like not acceptable to another part of society, but they would be all allowed to coexist within society because the diversity was natural. So in that sense of secularism as allowing free expression of ideas, or a um, diverse set of beliefs to coexist, absolutely, that has always been the case. In terms of separation of religion and state, which is the other notion that secularism means, it's actually, as I said, not so applicable to India, because uh, the notion of a theocracy itself doesn't make any sense. I mean, there is no pope, there is no central authority, there is no dogma, there is no doctrine that everybody has to adhere to. So the what it means really from an Indian point of view is, we have this notion of dharma, which is natural law or what is right. And if you said separate dharma from state, which is separate what is naturally right from the affairs of the state, that would be absurd. The whole point is everybody has their own dharma. The king has their dharma that they have to adhere to. The mother has her dharma, the father has a dharma, the child has a dharma, the brother has a dharma. They even say, well, the lion, when it kills a deer, it's following its dharma, it's in its nature. You can't condemn the lion for killing a deer because that's exactly its nature. You can't condemn the snake for biting because it's in its nature. So dharma is really what is intrinsic to our nature, and discovering that, for human beings, discovering that which is swadharma, is a big part of the path. What is my dharma, and what is right action for me in this particular circumstance given my role.
That's really interesting. I feel like that sort of clarifies the big thing that people in, the West are sort of confused by, because our concept of religion is, or spirituality, I guess it's different, right? We see things
Absolutely.
a different way. Um, do you have any sort of final thoughts before we close out?
No, I think this movement and this quest that you are on, and so many people are starting to discover, whether it's in Europe or other parts of the world. I think it's really, I see it as really a positive movement for the world, coming back into our own, finding our own self, our own roots, our own traditions, and coming back to the way of nature, uh, which there's a Sanskrit word called swabhava, which is what is natural to me. How do I act in the world in the way which is natural to me? And I think that is what has been taken away from us, and that is what has caused all this environmental damage and all these other things that are going on. So the more we return to our roots and return to the way of nature versus stories of a transcendental God who's sitting there judging us, who's going to destroy this earth anyways because it's not worth anything, it's all sinful. I think a return to the indigenous, to the traditions that value the land and the soil and are rooted in that, and the water and the rivers and the trees, I think is beautiful for the world. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. I will definitely keep on that project, and thank you for doing what you're doing. Where can people find you? Where's your corner of the internet?
Well, on Twitter, you can follow me on at Sankrant, Sankrant. And I also have a blog, sankrant.org. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, and you can respond on. I check Twitter fairly often, so drop me a message.
Perfect. This has been our episode. If you want to find me, I'm Georgina Rose or Dot Darling, DAT, on pretty much all social media platforms. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Telegram, and pretty much everywhere else. I'm also on Patreon if you want to support the show to enable us to keep making more episodes. If you're a high enough tier, you get your name read off. If you opt into that, it's optional. You don't have to do that if you want your nominee. So thank you to Shiraz, Neva, Lilith, Jonah, Nauseated, and Lee for your continued support. This has been our show. Thank you for listening to the Postmodern Iconoclast, and have a good day, night, afternoon, mid morning, evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. All right.